today we're going to talk about the torso throne. The torso throne is just my interesting name for keeping a neutral spine and feeling like you're sitting within your own neutrality, emotionally and mentally, and meeting whatever arises as it comes, without delay, without hesitation, but without leaving your throne. And so we can think of throne as your structure. We can think of throne as your posture. The throne is essentially the base where you are most in tune and in touch with yourself and have the most options. So it's a good place to operate from. And when we think about the benefits of posture, good posture is a posture where you have lots of options with minimal effort. And when we think about the idea of there being this really strong neutral throne, what that could apply to is various. So we have things like lifting, gymnastics, any form of strength training, any time when you need to know how to access the drivers of the hips and legs and the connective tissue slings, especially anything axial where the spine is under load, but equally things like crawling, we can apply this throne idea. So it's the neutrality of the spine, but it's not just that, it's also the dynamics of pressure and tension throughout the torso, and a certain quality of fullness and containment which remains despite which vectors or angles you're moving with. So in terms of a conversation, let's say, because I always think this is a great metric of a physical practice in its ability to help you feel centered and feel secure in yourself and capable. In a conversation, the torso throne applies to the idea of feeling your seat, feeling your neutrality, feeling your baseline response to the world around you, so that you can then notice when you're reacting. And perhaps because of the fullness of the torso and the floatiness of the bones aligning to help you sit, you'll notice that your posture starts to round, or you'll notice that you start to open up from that point, or you'll notice that you kink into one part of the body or another. And all of these things can show us corresponding patterns in our mental or emotional responses to events. So the torso throne is about having this regal posture through life, not because you're above anyone, not because you're special, but because you are present with yourself and because you know your own spine. You stand on your own 2 feet. All of these ideas of integrated strength and integrity. And then when you show up to any other domain in life, you know you have that throne. And the principle is that you remain there, you meet things as they are, you address them in the way you need to, without rigidity and without the fight or flight response which comes from not knowing your body, not knowing yourself, not knowing your body in space, not knowing your biomechanics, not knowing the way you breathe, not knowing the way to align your structures and leverage your connective tissue, but also not knowing your boundaries, not knowing where you're most comfortable, not knowing what you expect and what you value and how you can meet people and what you have to give. So we have this cohesive idea of a throne, and now we're going to explore it in a few different movement contexts. So let's look at this first layer. This is just to understand the concept of the throne, and from that basic concept or principle or feeling, we're then going to take it outside of the seated context into more dynamic contexts, like the squat or like the plank, or even more fluid connected movement. So the essence of this is that I'm sitting on something which is relatively firm, and I'm sitting with my knees just below my hips. This is because I don't want to feel any excessive need for tension through my hips right now. I don't want to feel like I'm fighting against my own mobility edges. I want to be able to introduce as much relaxation and release as possible through the legs. So this isn't about mobility. It's not about proving anything to yourself. This is about just finding a seat where you can truly feel your sit bones and feel your base, and then allow what's beneath that to relax. I do want you to have your feet in contact with the ground, and you can have your feet placed so that Your knees are kind of over your midfoot or over your shoelaces and just outside of hip width. We're going to work through an alignment practice here, and the purpose of this is to feel how your bones disappear in perception. So a lot of people talk about alignment of the torso in terms of stacking, and that's a great way to understand the role of the rib cage orienting over the pelvis so that you can create a certain zone of apposition, a zone where you're containing your internal pressure, and then as you breathe, that pressure builds and is held from spilling forward and therefore supports the back of the body and the spine into more tensegrity. So just quickly, tensegrity is the way the yang structures or linear harder structures of your bones interact with the elastic structures in the soft tissues. Bones can only push, bones do not yield, and soft tissues do yield, and they really only stretch or connect those bones. So when we're orienting the bones in a way which creates the zone of apposition or the containment to then fill with the pressure of the breath, which just happens naturally and fluctuates to a degree naturally, but we can dial up that pressure. What we're then doing is as the pressure builds, we're encouraging a lengthening of the connective tissues or a slight stretch of the connective tissues coupled with the alignment of our bones, which means we get this elastic supported structure without tonicity and effort. So I'm just arranging and orienting my skeleton in such a way that it's very efficient and that those connective tissues can hold me in a certain shape, but I'm doing that with the minimum effort. I'm directing that through my body awareness and through my attention to detail, and the result of that is a more integrated structure which can respond in beautiful ways, but I'm not making that happen excessively. So with that idea, we're going to feel through the sit bones. We're going to feel through the feet as well, the soles of the feet, making sure that the feet are soft enough to be responsive and in touch with the ground through as much of the foot as possible. So I almost want you to imagine your feet as a slightly melty substance, and the more you relax that substance, the more it sort of spills downward to the floor and spreads out in every direction, kind of like syrup. So that syrupy quality, I want you to have that in your soft tissues. I want you to explore that. Then we're feeling most of the weight on the hips. The feet are just light, they're just resting, but they're connected, and the weight through the hips is through the sit bones. Now, if the sit bones are pointing downward, that's going to help the pelvis to orient in a position where the spine grows tall, as if the pelvis was a plant pot. You can explore the rocking of your pelvis here by gently tilting forward, allowing your belly to open up a little bit and your lower back to compress a little bit, or tilting back, allowing your lower back to expand and open as the belly area compresses. So what I want you to find is what feels like the most neutral balance of compression and expansion on both sides, which relates to your pelvis being neutral. And generally, if you're feeling any compression or tightness in your lower back, it's pretty self-explanatory. That's going to mean that you shift your mass slightly back and let the pelvis roll under you into a little bit of a tuck, and that will encourage more of a lengthening of the connective tissues in the back. And then when you breathe into that, breathing into that area as best you can, you may feel more supported by the connective tissues, and your bones may feel lighter, like there's more space and less compression. And so the bones, relative to the feeling of the muscles and the containment, start to disappear and float. If you're feeling a sense of length in the back or strain in those muscles, sometimes you can come forward a little bit. So if I was touching this point in space, I'd be bringing that forward by bringing my belly button forward and by shifting my mass forward into an anterior tilt. This is something which is just going to require a bit of exploration, but I want you to feel the most efficient stacking you can until the bones float, until this feels more effortless. Now, as you're doing that, you can explore how you arrange this. So the way you arrange this, the rib cage, is going to affect the way the lower body feels. And it doesn't just operate in these parts, obviously, of pelvis and rib cage. It actually operates through every vertebra. But if we take this large frame perspective, then it can help us to understand the smaller parts and how they relate. So as I shift my chest forward, if I keep the same pelvic position and I don't let that come with me, then I end up looking like this. So if you look at the shape of my spine, that structure for this exercise is not perhaps going to allow me to contain as well between the front of my ribs and my pelvis, because they're not lined up very well in the way that the tissues connect. There's some slack, or the bony shape isn't operating as a structural container, even if my soft tissues are doing their best to contain. So I'm not starting from the highest point of efficiency here. If I go back here and I move my sternum way back and I don't take my pelvis with me, then I'm going to feel compression in my lower back quite quickly as these lower vertebrae run out of space. So anytime I'm adjusting up here, that's going to affect the space on the front and back of my spine. So what I want you to feel is this blend of sit bones down and sternum soft. At the same time, a light sense of lift through the meeting point of the collarbones towards the throat. I know these are subtle cues. It's more about your sense of connecting with them. My weight is over my sit bones. My sternum is soft. As soon as the sternum goes soft, the ribs do this. And as the ribs do that, I get a little bit of containment now, and I can feel that my belly is kind of buoyant and it's almost pressing back like an inflated water balloon against the dropping of the ribs, which gives me some support through my spine. We want the spine to be supported from both sides. And so you can think of the belly as the front of the spine and the back as the back of the spine. Now from here, I have this containment, and I can work on gently elongating through the space between my collarbones. And I want to keep a fullness in my back as I do that. And I'm going to grow tall through the rear crown of my head. So what we're looking for is this feeling of equal amounts of compression and expansion on both sides of each vertebra of the spine all the way up. If you need to make any adjustments, you can make those adjustments. You can explore subtle shifts in how you're aligning. You can explore where things feel most effortless for you. And a really, really good way to do this is with a partner. I was introduced to this by Juan Reda, who is running Cora Movement School. And he had us place our hand on our partner's head, just over the rear crown. So you'd say in I suppose, the back third of the head. And that downward pressure would be applied gradually. And as you gradually apply that pressure, that gives the seated person feedback as to what the longest and most effortless orientation of their spine is. So now we have this really core idea of expansion from the center of the body. If you think about expanding from the center of the body, it's not a specific point in space. The perception of the center of the body is where you can expand from to create balanced tensions throughout the whole system. So it's not some imaginary center of mass idea. It is the feeling of where is my center. If I had a little red orb in the center of my body that was pulsing, alive, breathing, where I felt the most warmth, where would that center be? And how can I grow from there in every direction? So as we breathe into that space in the very center, it starts to fill the body with a little bit of pressure. And as we sit here, we're lengthening from rear crown of the head to sit bones. Feeling the most efficient orientation of the spine. You may have to play with this. It's possible that you'll find areas of chronic tension or areas that really want to work hard. And also, so the surface you're sitting on is quite important here, how you're sitting on that. This has some ridges in it, this box. From that center, you're growing. From that center, you're breathing. And from that center, you're feeling. Making sure the hips are relaxed. If you feel like you're tensing in your hip flexors, you're probably leaning back too much. If you feel like you're grabbing in the bottoms of the hips, then you're leaning forward too much. And we also have these different planes to play with, so you can explore degrees of rotation. That adds a layer of complexity, which you may not be ready for yet, but you also may be craving that. So you can explore movement in the frontal plane, which is, if you're watching from the front, you will see me move. I'll be moving sideways, but the frontal plane is viewing from the front. You can explore movement we already have in the sagittal plane, which is watching from the side, this stuff. And then the transverse, which you can think T for top, looking down from the bottom. How am I rotated? You can spend a long time playing with the torso throne. A long time just sitting and feeling. And this is where the next layer of this really works, okay? So we have this biomechanical layer of supporting the spine with pressure, aligning the bones until they float, feeling how the head sits over the rest. But you also have this layer, which is the constant unfolding process of being aware of your body and understanding yourself and your reactions and responses. The last part of this that we'll add in terms of alignment is connecting the tongue with the roof of the mouth. Not just the tip of the tongue behind the teeth, but also the middle and as far back on the tongue as possible to the roof of the mouth, to the top palate. And as you do that, I want you to do it gently, and I don't want you to press it forward or up too much. Instead, I want you, with your mouth closed and your teeth lightly apart, jaw floating, to just create a little bit of suction between the tongue and the roof of the mouth. You should be able to do that. If you're creating the suction, you should be able to make that noise. It's that kind of feeling with the lips closed. And then you'll find that with that release of the facial tension and jaw tension, because the tongue is suctioned, you often feel more relaxed through your whole spine too. So with the tongue suctioned to the roof of the mouth, lengthening through the rear crown, can allow the jaw to sink a little bit and be suspended. So when you do arrive at a nice alignment here, and often it takes a few minutes to kind of settle in and allow your body to work through some things and relax into what is most comfortable and efficient for you, you can then spend a lot of time just being still and working on the subtleties. And where the subtleties come from, so let's say there's some backache, I'm not just going to address it on the skeletal or biomechanical level. I'm also going to address it on the level of tonicity, emotion, and thought. So if I'm feeling backache or pain in my back, then what's happening is there is a fixation in the system on a place where I can't dissipate load. We can think of that load as stress. If I want to dissipate that stress, I can do that mentally and emotionally as well. And what's interesting is, because physical sensation is tied to an area in the brain, and because there is a physical neural pathway connecting and cross-wiring that physical sensation with a set of experiences that I've had, emotions and beliefs about myself and about that sensation, if I explore different states of being emotionally and different thoughts mentally while I relate to the same part of my body physically, then I'm creating more options for the ways that I feel that part of my body. And this is why often the thing that heals people from chronic pain is A, relating to themselves differently, not as someone in pain, but just someone who is enjoying their life as much as possible. B, healthy relationships, and those healthy relationships bring about different ways of interacting and therefore different feelings in the body, different biochemistry. And well, let's go for a C. The third part, C, is that these things create different thoughts about the self, different thoughts about who I am, what life is, and what this sensation means. If the sensation I'm feeling in my body doesn't mean that there's going to be more danger or injury or damage, then I stop fearing it so much. I can stop fearing it because I've built a biomechanical skill set or I've become stronger, but I can also stop fearing it just because I'm experiencing a state of joy or connection. And so this is the biopsychosocial model of pain, and it's the idea that you can rewire experience by relating to it in different ways. And so what we need are these different inputs, and these different inputs come from different aspects of life. You know, friends, family, work, practices, places, sensory inputs in the moment too, like what's touching you in a particular area. Is it hot? Is it cold? It's such a complex nexus of interactions always happening in you. The point is, when you feel something, you can relate to it in different ways by changing something around that feeling. So if I have a sore back, what if I soften my hands? What if I feel my face soften as the hands soften? Suddenly I want to take a deeper breath just because I've done that. My body's doing that. I'm not doing it. I'm just letting my body adjust. I connect the tongue with the roof of the mouth. I use that suction to support my head. And for me, when I do that, I feel a very, very subtle softening of the muscles around the occipital region, the base back of my skull, and the sides of my neck too. So the added support and stability on my midline and the tongue suction towards the roof of my mouth creates a mode where my body feels like I'm hugging myself into support. And in that support, there's no need for the protection mechanism, the alarm system of the pain. And so we've taken this journey with the seated practice from a very structural external alignment inward towards a more nuanced body-mind experience, a somatic experience. But the other way of approaching this would be to set a really beautiful scene, like go somewhere wonderful, or create a wonderful little pocket of the world just next to you with the things you love. And we talked about this in the first week of baseline. So you have rituals, or you have your cherished relationships, or your cherished practices. And in setting that container, you can elicit the emotions in a very genuine and like authentic sense of safety, belonging, joy, feeling. And from that, your body's going to orient itself differently because those states of being are cross-wired to different tension patterns in your body. And when you access a different version of yourself in how you're feeling and in who you think you are and all of the sensory inputs, your body is not going to stubbornly hold on to the same ones it used for a completely different situation. As soon as you're aware of where you are, as soon as you check in, your body's going to say, okay, well, you're checking in with me. This is different. Let's adapt. So this is where environment becomes very important. But yeah, you can access this alignment in this sense of I'm in my throne, which is a very peaceful but also very potentiated place from the structure or from the emotion or from the belief. So don't just feel that you have to remember specific cues. My intention with those cues is to help you access this sense of being in your center and being in yourself and being in a mode of operating which is really balanced and really primed. So let's visit the next layer of this practice. And we're going to combine and condense everything that we spoke about in the seated section into a classical movement, the squat. So I suggest using a front loading for this, if you're going to use any loading at all, and sometimes the front loading for squats is a helpful counterbalance. I have other videos on how to progress and how to begin the journey with loaded squats and some training constraints and setups which are going to be really helpful for you to progress quickly. You don't have to make things complicated with the squat pattern. That's the beauty of it. You can set yourself up in a way which is really conducive to feeling stable, and that gives you a lot of load potential. And really what you're looking for is the ability to load your structures in a supportive and helpful way. So sometimes you don't need to complicate that. It would be better to have like a really free form, snaky, noodly, loose movement practice. And then if you're going to do squats, often it's good to just work with some simple alignment principles and heavy loads and really just create raw capacity and then explore the edges and round that out. And eventually over time you can start to blend those together, but that doesn't need to be something that you do initially. So with the squat, we have very similar principles to the seated practice actually. But to condense it, what we're going to focus on are a couple of things. The first is going to be your connection with the floor. So in the seated practice, we were connecting through the sit bones and the feet were touching, and we talked about having the feet being very receptive and melty and having this syrupy, sticky, broad quality on the floor. And then we had our sit bones being the point of contact with the box. I'm still going to use a box for this variation of squats, and I suggest that it's a really good way to understand the torso throne concept in different squatting scenarios. I actually think that you should be box squatting whenever you explore a new movement if you really want to dial in your understanding of your spine and pelvis, because there's nothing like a tactile cue. There's nothing like not having to think, just being able to feel, oh, there's my touch point and now I'm coming up. Less processing going on up here, less remembering in the process of squatting means increased ability to feel. Get out of your head, just feel it. This is about working with your body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to center myself over my feet, a lot like the standing practices we've worked on. And there's another video for standing practices, obviously, if you want to go see that. The essence is that my weight is through my midfoot and that my foot is very much balanced. All throughout this squat, I want to feel very much in contact with the floor, meeting the floor. Just as we meet experiences when we're centered and we're not passive in the world, we're not clinging, but we meet things as they come up. We don't let things gather and bubble and build and get distorted. We're meeting the floor. Like, I'm feeling the floor. I'm not just collapsing into myself and like hanging out in my structures up here. I'm meeting the floor and I'm standing. This applies to all kinds of lifting where the axial loads or the gravitational loads and the weight are trying to collapse your structure. That's the whole point of resistance training. It's to add stress to your structure. So if I'm in a hinge, it's going to be the same concept where I'm really, really, really going to dial in my balance, and I'm going to make sure that in every point in that hinge, my balance is dialed, and I'm very much in touch with my feet, and I'm very much feeling not just where my weight is, front, back, mid, outside, inside, but I'm also feeling any degree of rotation through my foot as I coil into my arches. Are they more passive? Are they more active? Where is the sweet spot where I can feel very connected, very elastic, and very well structured to align above that? So this feels fantastic now. And it's actually relatively light on my heels because I'm using the connective tissue in the bottom of my foot under some tension to help that travel up my legs. Okay, so it's simply this idea of being a little bit springy, as if you were jumping or catching. So this for me feels really good for a hinge, and I immediately feel like I have access to the whole back of my body. I feel very connected. That's the feeling you'll go for. It starts with feeling the floor, feeling the feet. In a squat, it's similar, except that because you're going to go a little bit deeper, you might not be able to access that springiness the whole way down and also be able to balance yourself. So bear that in mind, okay? How deep do you want to squat? And what is my anatomy? Can I insist on being light on my heels, or in order to get deep and apply force and maintain the most important structure, do I have to allow my weight to shift back? The feet are a key feature. Regardless of how you organize, it comes from the feet. That is how you balance. If you're not balanced, you're going to drop the weight, you're going to lift the weight in a way which is not super efficient. And of course, it's okay to train all of these different contexts, but I want you to understand what balanced feels like and what neutral feels like. I want you to understand the rules, and then later on you can break them as much as you can, but you'll know where you're coming from, and you'll hopefully have a clearer idea of the effect of that and why you want to do that. So here, I'm staying in touch with my feet. I'm staying very much in touch with my balance. I'm going really slow, and I'm feeling my sit bones leading the way down. I'm feeling the sensation of the back of my rib cage being aligned over my sit bones. Now, it's a sensation of alignment. It's a sensation of connection. So even if I lean forward, I still want to feel that sensation of connection between my mid-back, the back of my ribs, and my sit bones. We're going to keep it really simple. If I lean forward, still, can I feel the connection between the back of my ribs and my sit bones? Can I feel that line and where it is? Now the line is directing this way. Now the line is directing this way and then into these tissues, into my feet. But it's still there. There's still an awareness of this space. And the reason we stay aware of that space is the same as what we practice when sitting. It's the zone of apposition. When there's just enough containment here and just enough expansion here, we get to rely on the stretchy connection of the thoracolumbar fascia, which is like a thick, thick diamond of connective tissue, which is very deep and sits in this area of the body and can create or transmit a lot of force through it, and it can really stabilize us. In Taiji Chuan, the yao is, loosely speaking, this area, and a lot of the postures are directed or guided by the orientation of the yao. And when we're sitting or squatting, we want to be in touch with that too, okay? So you have your feet, and then what's the orientation from here through this diamond? And that, if I start to lose my balance, I'm going to adjust something, I'm going to change something. But if I really, really go slow and I let my feet be heavy, you'll notice that then my body starts to adjust from lower down. I'm feeling through that thoracolumbar fascia area, I'm feeling the connection of my back ribs over my sits. And as I go lower, I naturally want to adjust from lower in my body. And so I'm grounded because I'm making adjustments low. I'm grounded in my body. That helps me to orient efficiently from low down rather than get all wiggly higher up. And the purpose of this is to maintain the throne, so we're not going to get all wiggly. So what I'm feeling for then is a touch of my sit bones. And if I use a weight, then I have this going on. Feeling my organization going very slowly, feeling the touch of the sit bones. And now instead of like driving up with my butt or thinking about things too much, I'm just going to shift my weight so that it gets lighter on the box and heavier on my feet. And then I'm going to drive length from feet through to the rear crown of my head. So this is the expansion from center idea. The load is compressing me. The load wants to bully me. I'm expanding from my center, driving through the ground, driving through the space. The rear crown and the feet apart. Expansion. When I go down, I'm still resisting into them. I'm still pressing into the ground, feeling the crown of my head. I'm still expanding and contained in my torso. But there's a certain pressurization or compression. And then at the bottom, I'm able to release that and get tall again. That, to me, is the essence of the torso throne and having a really beautiful, very whole body squat where you're integrating the breath, you're integrating the elasticity and the muscles. It just feels like a great way to move. So, in terms of generating pressure, first off, my structure helps me create the pressure, and my structure helps me to access the elastic tissues. So we've talked about that. It's that sense of lengthening and being connected with the feet, the ribs, the back over the sit bones, and the rear crown of the head. That's the structure. And then how we utilize that structure is we use the breath. Now, if I take a huge breath and my whole body expands, I'm likely to lift my chest. I'm likely to flare my ribs a little bit. Even if I don't, right? It doesn't matter. Even if I don't do any of those things, let's say I keep the position I'm in, but I just really expand. Because I'm expanding the space, that might be helpful when I want to create more joint space for the shoulders to move or something, or to stretch something open and to mobilize. But it's not going to create more pressure because pressure relies on the space being the same size. Pressure only increases when there's nowhere for that material to escape to. And so what we can do is just keep a very, very neutral stance with that little bit of containment in the front and that proudness from crown to feet and awareness of the sit bones and how we're going to move. And then we just take a sip. It's literally just a little sip of air. And if you've got a little bit of a brace on, and a brace is the shortening or support of the abdominal muscles and the obliques, then what you'll find is that pressurizes and supports you very quickly, and you don't have to do this exaggerated brace thing. When you see people doing this, it's because they don't understand how to use their structure and they don't understand how to contain pressure. If you could have a structure which contained pressure, then you would not need much to pressurize very quickly. In fact, what you can do to feel the pressurization inside of this area is breathe out and then feel the tension. It helps you to breathe out, yeah? Then sip. I'm not super inflated, but I am pressurized. I have the combination of the bones being long, pressing out. I have the shrink wrap of the muscles, and that position as I then move through the hips and keep that intent to be long, leverages my connective tissue and my elastic connections a little bit better. So, front-loaded squat, nice and tall. feels really good. If I want to now work with an exercise like a B stance hinge, which is another one of my favorite ones, then I'm going to apply this same concept. I'll show you this way. With a staggered stance, so my feet are hip width apart, my back foot is just behind the heel of my front foot. And I'm going to put most of the weight over my front foot. So I'm actually going to shift my mass over that front foot. And then I'm going to turn my body slightly towards it so that I'm looking down towards my third or fourth toe. So if I line this up in front, I've got this kind of stance, shift the weight towards the front foot, apply the same concepts, meeting the ground, long crown of the head, feeling my sit bones. That little bouncing action there really helps me to feel into how my structure is organizing and where the load's being taken. I want to feel elastic and connected and light through my spine. A slight turn towards the third and fourth toe. So you can see where I'm going to be reaching. Now you can do this without weight. You can reach and you're feeling foot, sit bones, crown, lengthening, and there's an awareness of the fullness in your back ribs. And as you do this, I'd suggest you do it in a way where you're getting quite light on your front heel, where that front heel is almost floating off the ground and where most of the weight is on the front foot and the back foot's very light. Because that is going to engage the connective tissue in the bottom of your foot, which will then help to support the entire posterior chain through the whole back of the body right to here. Lengthening through the ears and the rear crown, tongue suction to the roof of the mouth. And then go slow and feel how that structure is organizing itself. And don't lose these concepts that you're developing. Don't just let them go to touch your hands to the ground. Feel the development of the sensations you're looking for. And the bracing is the same. So if I do it this way, what you'll see is I can hold the weight like this, but I could also bear hug the weight. There's so many ways to load these. It doesn't matter too much. The principles are what matter. From here, when I'm coming up, you'll notice that I'm not just getting up, however, I'm lengthening from my center again. That's really key. So I'm in this position, heel is light, feeling the third and fourth toes lining up under the back of my neck, long through my sits and my crown. My structure is really good, so I feel really comfortable speaking. And then to stand up, I'm going to lengthen through the floor and through my crown. So that's a different feeling from just wedging my hips between and then pressing up. It's a different feeling from extending through my back and then bringing my hips through. It is about staying in my balance and lengthening to occupy the space, and my body will move how it needs to. So you could apply this same principle with much heavier weights, and I certainly do in my training when I'm using a barbell and thinking the same things. And if you were to literally just start with those two, a front-loaded squat, again, you could use a barbell, you could use a heavy sandbag, a B stance hinge on both legs. All right, so if you just dedicated yourself to learning those two movements really well, applying these principles, that's the key, then you would have a great fundamental strength base to build upon. And you can just apply progressive overload, which means tracking your sets, tracking your reps, and just gradually increasing either the time you spend, the weight you use, the frequency of training, applying these principles. So when you can no longer feel those cues of balance and elongation and expansion and the whole-bodied, single-bodiedness of the fascia connecting, then you're not really applying the same stimulus. Okay, so it's important that you do it with that intention. But you can equally apply this to many other positions. Once you understand the concept of the torso throne, and you can feel your center, and you can feel that balance of elongated, expanded tensions, you can then work with stuff like a back bend, where you're feeling sit bones, you're feeling crown, there's an elongation, and you can work then with beginning to go off center down the track, but the torso throne idea is to really help you identify and truly connect with that first. So all of the more circular, flowy movements, it's kind of a different thing. This idea is about maintaining the frame. Now, if you wanted to apply this in, let's say, a Cossack or a different kind of stance where you're off center, you're working with some different angles asymmetrically, then the same principles apply. This sense of lengthening, this sense of sinking into the feet, the crown reaching from the sit bones. And you need to be aware of these points. So sit bones, feet, crown constantly elongating. And then you have this fullness. And then you can work with these different angles and these different depths, always releasing and relaxing through the hips and always using the minimum necessary tension. If this applies to a upper body movement, then the throne idea means that you're not going to collapse in, you're not going to side bend, you're essentially not going to move from that fullness and that length as you press. Now, a lot of people, when they're pressing from a muscular standpoint, are looking at things like skeletal lockout. So I just need to extend my tricep, I just need to kind of wedge my bones underneath the weight. But that wedging of the bones underneath the weight and that kind of sitting into the structures is not the same thing as the feeling of floating and expanding the structures to create lightness and then directing the movement through into the space to claim one's space and the space that we're moving into. So let me demonstrate the difference between the two. And I'm going to exaggerate this physically, but there is also an internal felt difference, which is very important to just connect with. So if I'm just going to press this overhead anyhow, maybe it's like that, okay? So I'm kind of wedging myself under a bit of a side bend. If I'm applying this principle, then I'm feeling the sits. Perhaps I'm even feeling a little bit of the feet, the crown, and I have this opening. I'm actively meeting the weight where it is, and then I project through space, and I'm feeling connectivity the whole time. So perhaps even if I were to do this and really lock out and press up, for my body, that might mean that I'd lost connectivity. If it doesn't for you, when you can really press and reach and have a much more open finish position, then that's great. But if you need to kind of compromise yourself to get there, you're not training the same quality. So it's important that you keep that expansion from the center, and you can set yourself up in different ways or with different loads to allow you to stay in touch with that feeling. Now the next part here is, if I wanted to explore this torso throne idea of expansion and of making my body translucent because it's so efficiently lined up, then I can press into a rig like this. I can take a bladed stance, so kind of like a horse stance or sinking down, a little bit like martial arts or boxing. And the idea is applying the principles, sit bones through the feet, sinking the feet through the ground, feeling my weight, surrendering my weight down, very much balanced and in touch with the ground, growing through the rear crown. And then I reach, and if I just think about like doing this, it's not the same as projecting through the reach point. But if I truly, from the floor and from my central equilibrium, press or reach, expanding through the reach point, that's very different. That's a very different feeling. I can actually feel a little bit of a sensation of nerves gliding and elongating. And I feel like because of that reaching and that expansion, my body becomes one piece. I'm not one piece because I'm tensing, I'm one piece because I'm in touch with myself in space. And then if I apply force, the force could be measured. You would feel that I'm applying force. For instance, I could apply the force and move the rig, but I am not feeling a lot of force within myself and within my structure because the orientation or alignment of my body is precise. And that orientation or alignment doesn't just come from the bones being in some theoretical perfect position. It comes from the organization of my soft tissues and connective tissues too, in such a way that helps me express as one expansive piece. So then if you explore this idea with a partner, if you're pressing into someone else's body, that's when it can get really interesting, because you have their nervous system also feeding back with yours. And if I were to press into you and we both had an outstretched hand like this, then we'd very quickly feel our reactions to one another. We would feel how, as you press me one way, if I'm tight, I'm probably going to be resisting and fighting back. And that makes it very easy for you to feel where I'm most attached and where I'm trying to find my center. When you then become aware of me trying to find my center in a particular way, if you're listening and if you're not insisting but you are holding your position, just as I did with the rig then, you're going to be able to manipulate me quite easily. So in a martial context, this harks back to the idea of I know my opponent, but my opponent doesn't know me. So the more I can listen and the better I know myself, the easier it is to see the tendencies my opponent has, because I've seen them before, I've felt them before, I've worked through them myself. But if my opponent doesn't have that neurology, if they're not yet able to release, listen, and utilize their structure in the efficient way that I can, then I'm going to appear invisible to that opponent. Basically, I'm not going to react and respond in a way that they're familiar with, that they have an embodied understanding of. So as we practice, as we get better at feeling the efficiency and being able to trust our body through a sense of balance, our brain is constantly upgrading the circuitry and we're constantly accessing this deeper layer of embodied intelligence. So this then applies to other realms too. If you think about the idea of approaching a challenge, maybe it's a work project, maybe it's a creative project, and that challenge is applying a certain amount of stress to you. In fact, you can think of any situation applying stress to you. There are going to be a couple of things about that situation which are very, very essential, which need to be met, and which need to be met appropriately from a grounded place where your intention is potent. But there's going to be a lot of other things about that situation which don't need to be dealt with. A lot of things that, if taken too seriously, and if you insist upon, will actually make things a lot more difficult for you and will very much dilute your efforts rather than helping your yang side, the yang quality of your being, penetrate through the obstacle. So these practices are about constantly refining what is most essential in every moment. And that's a process going towards what is most essential and releasing that which doesn't matter. If you're speaking to someone and you're having an animated discussion and there starts to be a little bit of tension, that tension is coming partly from you. And if you dissipate the tension around what is not essential and you are able to remember and release into the focus of what is essential, then there aren't many buttons that that person can press in the conversation for you. You're not protecting all of your ideas and all of your belief systems. You're purely coming from a place of knowing yourself, and you know your boundaries and you know what you believe in, and you're constantly reforming that to be ever more precise. And so you can then trust that the conversation is going to go fine because you're going to look after yourself. You know where you stand, and you're presenting with integrity in that. So you don't have to preempt the other person or control them in any way. They can say what they want. You can be open and yet protected, rather than super open and super vulnerable, or super guarded but unable to connect. Okay, so this way of being is very generative. It's very life-giving. Okay, so what I want you to do now is to explore familiar movements with the intention of the torso throne principle being felt. So let's say you're in a side plank. How does that relate to the ideas we've talked about today? Obviously, you're going to need to feel the points of contact. You're going to need to be very in touch with those. You're going to need to be very in touch with your sense of center and emanating and exuding your strength from there. And you're not going to be adding any extra muscle tone. There are going to be lines of tension. Your connective tissue, your body is going to be tensioning appropriately, but you're going to be feeling into what is most appropriate. And that's how you'll leverage your body's structure and get more out of this with less effort. There may be the mental effort of releasing your insistence on the usual patterns of just tensing up not to feel. There may be a lot of shaking or tremoring, for example, but that is actually a really good sign that your nervous system is recalibrating, figuring out new, more efficient ways to organize itself. And that's neurogenesis, that's neuroplasticity, that's a really, really good quality to allow yourself that correct type of struggle. Now you can also think about something like a handstand, and perhaps you do that with your chest to the wall for support, to the degree that you're able to open your shoulders. You might find that it's a more readily accessible position to feel the floating of the bones and the reaching and the alignment. If you don't have very open shoulders, then you're going to need strong ones. So this brings us to another idea. When you're standing, when you're in these shapes, when you're doing the squat, when you're doing the hinge, when you're doing the press, are you supposed to be feeling nothing? Is it supposed to be super easy? No, you're going to be feeling more. You're going to be feeling more than you ever have. And you're not going to be fighting against that feeling. Instead, you're going to be letting the feeling in and through your body, so your body and your brain and your nervous system, one thing, can respond. So muscles need to strengthen if they need to strengthen. You need to be able to hold a position before you can release and trust in that position. You need to have a range of motion through your joints before you can release, trust, and refine that space. If you simply can't move your body in a particular range of motion with any strength at all, then what is there to release? You've never had it to begin with. So loaded mobility training, anything which helps you to access more of the three-dimensional space of your body is absolutely important too, along with this idea. And so like if I can't move my hands behind my body, then I need to spend as much time as possible applying these principles, feeling my center point, being truly stable through a present moment rearranging of my system, and then I need to explore reaching behind. And the more I relax and the more I elongate into that space, out through my fingertips and behind my body, while remaining stable, the more I'm teaching my body to go there without excess effort. But if I spend time there, absolutely it's going to be challenging. Things are going to burn, and that's completely fine. We're just not adding this noisy, useless, extra effort. So go out, explore different movements, explore different positions, see what you discover.